It is April 18th of 1943, and over the South Pacific, one of the most dramatic and famous events of World War II is about to take place. 2 Betty bombers and 6 Zero fighters have taken off from Rabaul and are headed to the Bougainville area, where they are bound to be intercepted by American P-38s. But much has been published on this, on the dramatic code-breaking and shoot-down of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. But here we will focus on something different, an aspect of this mission that has been mostly forgotten. In addition to the 2 Betty bombers lost on this sortie were 6 young men, flying A6 M30s and assigned to escort their esteemed leader. They would, however, fail to do so, allowing the most valuable asset of the Japanese Navy to be lost in the jungles of the South Pacific. And this brings us to the question, who were these men and what really happened to them? Today, we will cover these aviators who landed and survived the tragic mission, and how each of them, after such a devastating loss, charged themselves with redeeming themselves through a glorious death, but also with shooting down as many American fighters as possible. Let's dive into the history, follow these aces, and see what happened to the men who lost Yamamoto. In mid-April of 1943, on the island of Rabaul, pilots of the 204th Air Group had been fighting valiantly in the South Pacific, taking on the Americans over Guadalcanal and the other islands of the area. Here, some of their best pilots had already begun to rack up kills, learning to fly what was commonly considered one of the best planes in the war. One morning, however, they were called in for a briefing that would not be the normal sortie. This assignment was quite different and carried even more honor than the normal mission. Here, 6 pilots were selected and assigned, along with their A6 M30s, and told that on April 18th, they would receive the privilege of escorting the Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto on a routine inspection flight from Rabaul to Bougainville. The selected pilots would be Lieutenant Takashi Morisaki, lead pilot; Flyer First Class Kenji Yanagiya; Chief Petty Officer Toyomitsu Suiyino; Flyer First Class Shoichi Sugita; Chief Petty Officer Yashimi Hidaka; and Petty Officer First Class Yasushi Okazaki. All 6 of these Zero pilots accepted their assignment graciously and prepared to embark on the escort mission the very next day. But thousands of miles away across the Pacific, they had no idea that a nightmare was developing. A few days prior, a radio message was sent out by Yamamoto's assistant, letting the smaller air bases of the area know of the incoming inspection by the Admiral. Unfortunately for the Japanese, this transmission would be intercepted and deciphered by American codebreakers, revealing that the prized Admiral was going to be, very briefly, within range of American land-based fighters. As the plan was put together, everyone knew that it was a long shot. The flight plan would take the Admiral over heavily defended Japanese areas, teeming with fighters and anti-aircraft. Plus, the opportunity to intercept was at the absolute limits of the range of only the P-38 Lightning, the longest-ranged Allied fighter in the Pacific War at this time. So, even if the Americans did time it perfectly and safely locate the expected transport flight, American fighters would have only 15 minutes of combat time in the target area before they had to turn back for Guadalcanal. The plan would involve 2 groups of P-38s, one flying high and one below. Colonel John Mitchell and his group of 12 aircraft were scheduled to fly top cover, while one other group of 4 interceptors would be assigned to the low-level attack position. These would be the shooters. They were assigned to fly just off the surface of the water, at 50 feet of altitude and on radio silence to avoid detection. They had been directed to meet Yamamoto's flight from underneath and behind. This unit would be called the Killer Flight and would be led by Captain Thomas G. Lamphere. On the morning of April 18th, both the Japanese and American aircraft began to take off from their respective bases for the planned routes. Only one of them, however, was aware of the other's plans. As the flight of P-38s from the 339th Fighter Squadron took off, a couple of brief problems hit the Killer Flight of aircraft. Two of their P-38s had issues and had to be replaced with other aircraft from the top cover group. These replacements would be Lieutenant Besby Holmes and Lieutenant Raymond Hine, now joining Captain Lamphere and Lieutenant Rex Barber. Once this was sorted out and everyone was in formation, both groups of P-38s were off for their sneak attack to Bougainville. At the same time, a few hundred miles away, the 6-0 pilots, along with their precious Bettys, were also just starting up and taking off. Here, the Japanese were heading across a stretch of the Pacific Ocean before they would arrive over Bougainville. This flight consisted of 2 G-4M Betty bombers and the 6 escorting fighters. These Zeros quickly split up into 2 groups of 3 aircraft. The idea of their formation saw the Bettys flying below and in the center, with the Zeros above and slightly behind, to block the typical attack from American fighters, a diving strike from higher altitude. To defend against this, the first group of Zeros was here, on the left-hand side, above and behind. Petty Officer Toyometsu Sugino on the left. Petty Officer Shoichi Sugita on the right, the current kill leader of the 204th Air Group, and then the flight leader, Lieutenant Takeshi Murasaki, who was another seasoned pilot. On the right-hand side, Petty Officer Yasushi Okazaki was on the left. Petty Officer Kenji Yanagiya on the right, who was an ace with 7 or 8 kills at this time, and Chief Petty Officer Yashimi Hidaka as element leader, another ace with around 20 kills. At this point, Lieutenant Murasaki had his fighters in what he thought was an ideal defending position, and all was going as planned. His Zeros kept a crisp formation and began to scan the horizon for threats, but for now, all they saw was open ocean. On the other side, though, the American Lightnings were proceeding as planned, on schedule and under radio silence, with the Killer Squadron just off the surface of the water. With hopes of pulling off a miracle, Lamphere, Barber, Holmes, and Hine kept the tight formation and blazed across the Pacific. Time ticked away, and soon both flights were nearing their destination. At around 9:30 a.m., Yamamoto's transport plane had arrived over Bougainville Island. In fact, their destination had just been sighted up ahead, so the transports began to lose altitude as they were approaching the airfield at Balali. At this time in the flight, the escorting Zeros were also now above the island jungle of Bougainville, still scanning the skies over the Pacific side. They were, after all, at this point, fairly confident that on the low chance any threat would come, it would certainly come from the sea. Unfortunately for them, they were mistaken. The P-38s of the 339th were, at this moment, arriving on the scene. But they were not coming from the sea. With the low attack position of the Killer Flight, the attack would instead come from 6 o'clock and low, both positions which were not suspected by the escorting Zeros. And furthermore, at this point, their green camouflage now made them even more difficult to detect, blending in with the jungle as they approached Yamamoto's aircraft. The attack was about to begin, with the Killer Flight approaching low and the top cover flight at 20,000 feet above, directing and protecting the operation.
There were 2 bombs. instead of one. We'd been told the night before it'd be one. So I looked for the 6-0 escort. I looked behind, there were 3. I looked behind there were 3 more. And Mr. Yanagiya was in one of those 6-0s. They had not seen us at that point, so I immediately turned. I knew when I saw the 6-0s, I knew we had our target.
Bogies 11 o'clock high, we saw them. And that was really woke us all up, really. And there they were, 6-0s and 2 bombers. As Mitch said, we only planned on one. Well, we climbed up, as Mitchell said, and then Mitch said, "Go get him, Tom." And so Tom and his wife broke off and headed toward the bombers. Well, we could see these 3 zeros coming down, and we knew that just about the time that we rolled in on the bombers, that they would be right on our tail. And so Tom turned sharply left and up into the zeros as they were coming down. I continued after Yamamoto's airplane. I shot into his right engine, through the fuselage, into his left engine. The right engine was smoking badly at that time. I started back into the fuselage again, and as I centered my fire on the fuselage, he seemed to stop in midair as far as I was concerned, and came up on more or less on his one wing, and I shot over him, just missing his upturned wing. I looked back, and he had leveled out, but he was smoking very badly and going down. By this time, he was less than 300 feet from the top of the trees.
As the P-38s blazed in, Flyer First Class Kenji Yanagiya recalled this moment in detail.
I was on the right side, farthest away from Yamamoto's aircraft. I remember that as we approached the airfield, that is when it all happened. We were delayed in spotting the P-38s as their color made them very hard to see over the jungle. I can recall that by the time the squadron leader saw them, they were already very near the bombers. We immediately turned down to repel the American fighters, and we managed to do that. But as we climbed up to prepare for the second wave, I looked down, and Yamamoto's plane was already smoking and going down into the jungle. The second plane, the staff plane, was going towards the ocean to the right.
As the killer flight opened up their attack, before his plane ever crashed, Yamamoto was almost certainly already dead. In the burst from the American aircraft, Isoroku Yamamoto was hit in the head with a round from one of the P-38s. He was likely killed instantly, but if not, would have certainly been killed in the crash a few seconds later. For the escorting Zeros, it all happened too fast. By the time any of them could react, delayed in seeing the P-38s due to their location and camouflage, it was too late. The Zero pilots immediately dove in and scattered the P-38s, but they were clearly not here to dogfight. The Americans turned away and ran, leaving the engagement, having already accomplished their goal. So the Japanese pilots then also turned and landed back on their own airfield. That is, all except for Kenji Yanagiya, who saw an opportunity.
As the Americans began back to head towards Guadalcanal, we also turned for Balalai. But then, I saw one P-38 cruising at 9,000 feet alone. I decided to go after it, and there I fired, striking the aircraft. Those American fighters did not burst into flames easily, but it did start smoking and gushing gasoline after I hit it. At that point, I turned back for base, where I was the last to land because I chose to go after this enemy aircraft.
This P-38 would be that of Lieutenant Raymond Hine, who was one of the replacements in the killer flight. During this mission, he was seen smoking badly in one engine, but at last contact was still flying, trying to make it home. Unfortunately, he would not return and was never seen again, the sole American loss of this mission. Upon landing and then returning to Rabaul, the 6 escorting Zeros, who had all survived unscathed, felt as if they had failed. They were not, however, assigned any blame for the incident, as it was clearly pre-planned and they were desperately outnumbered. But it did change things for the young pilots. After such a brutal loss under their watch, their purpose in the war changed drastically. Not only were they now fighting for honor, but they held themselves responsible, and thus charged themselves with fighting wildly, with the challenge of shooting down as many American aircraft as possible, and perhaps most importantly, redeeming themselves through a glorious death for Japan. This redemption would, in fact, be achieved very quickly for more than one of the escort pilots. On June 5th of 1943, around 1 month later, a state funeral would be held for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, an event that was rare and closely followed by all of Japan. They had lost, debatably, their most valuable leader, so it was a moving and somber occasion. Appropriately, at the same time, thousands of miles away in the Southwest Pacific, 6 pilots of the 204th Air Group were preparing to restore their honor. Less than 48 hours after Yamamoto's funeral, the 204th Air Group would begin a massive aerial campaign against the Guadalcanal area, the same region that the dastardly P-38s had come from on April 18th. The Zero pilots from that mission would no doubt be fueled with a little more anger than normal after hearing of their admiral's funeral just a day before. Their assignment for today, June 7th of 1943, would see their Zeros outfitted with twin bombs underneath their wings and assigned to glide bomb an Allied airfield. A few hours later, the Zeros were in the air, along with dive bombers, and were nearing their target. Right on cue, American fighters were scrambled to intercept. The Zero pilots of the 204th initiated their glide attacks from an altitude of around 20,000 feet, dropping their bombs on the island airfield below. But just as they pulled up from their bombing runs, enemy fighters arrived. These would consist of Army P-38 fighters as well as F-4F Wildcats of the U.S. Marines and U.S. Navy. Here, an all-out battle ensued in the air. In the intense dogfight, tracers flew across the sky, and aircraft from both sides were hit. One of the first, however, to go down was Petty Officer Yasushi Okazaki. With an American fighter behind, his aircraft took a hit, and his Zero went down in flames, the first of the Yamamoto escorts to die his glorious death. But he would not be the only one lost on the day. Also struck in this engagement would be Chief Petty Officer and Ace Yashimi Hidaka. His Zero, too, would go down, and he would be killed in action, making the second loss of the Zero pilots from the famous April mission. But also in this engagement, another incident would happen with yet another of the Yamamoto escort pilots from the 204th Air Group. And this one perhaps even more gruesome than a quick and fiery death. Recently promoted Petty Officer Kenji Yanagiya, the Zero pilot who was on the far right of Yamamoto's infamous flight, had just finished his glide bombing run on the airfield on the Russell Islands. A few moments later, 2 F-4F Wildcats pulled behind his Zero and opened fire. Despite his attempts to evade, their rounds found their target, and his fighter was hit directly in the cockpit. As he tried to escape, a round entered his cockpit from behind and went directly through his right hand as it held on to the control stick. This bullet took off most of his right hand, leaving only his small finger remaining. His plane then spiraled out of control, with the F-4F Wildcats leaving him for dead. But miraculously, Yanagiya regained control of his Zero, using his left hand to take over the controls. At this moment, as he leveled off, he also realized though that his leg was seriously hit as well, bleeding profusely. With no other options, he turned for the nearest Japanese airfield, Munda, and tried to survive the flight. For the next few minutes, with one hand shot off and his right boot filling with blood, he began to feel lightheaded. Recognizing the serious risk of passing out from blood loss, Kenji Yanagiya started yelling at himself in the cockpit, trying desperately to keep himself awake. And somehow it worked. As he approached Munda Airfield with no right hand, he was unable to lower the landing gear and flaps, as both of those controls were on the right side of the cockpit, and he had no way to reach them without letting go of the stick. So he came in and crash landed, wheels up and with no flaps, screeching to a stop at Munda Airfield. Fortunately, Japanese Marines pulled him from the cockpit and immediately began to care for him, amputating his right hand and doing everything possible to stop the bleeding. Against the odds, he survived, and just a few weeks later was sent back to Japan to recover. Another Yamamoto Escort gone from the front. Meanwhile though, the fighting at the front lines continued, and the 3 remaining pilots from the Yamamoto mission were still hungry for blood. On June 16th, they would get another chance to get it. On this mission, a large group of Allied transport ships was spotted off the coast of Guadalcanal. The 204th Air Group yet again attacked in full force. Here, they were intercepted by a large American fighter force, and today, the Japanese would pay a high toll for the raid. More than 20 aircraft were shot down in this assault, as American P-38s dealt a heavy blow to their force. During this dogfight, one more escort pilot from the Yamamoto raid would be lost, and this would be flight leader Takashi Morisaki. During the battle, he was shot down and killed, achieving what he no doubt was aiming for, a glorious death and redemption. This now brought the total number of fighting pilots from the Yamamoto mission to just 2. 2 weeks later, a similar strike was again ordered that involved the 204th Air Group. This would see another attack against Allied shipping at Guadalcanal, and here another loss was incurred. Chief Petty Officer Toyomitsu Sugino went missing at some point during the engagement and was never seen again. Based on the information from the battle, it is assumed that he too was shot down and killed. In just 4 months following the April 18th loss of Yamamoto, 4 of the 6 Zero pilots were lost. Only 2 more remained alive, and only 1 at the front lines. This would be Flyer First Class Shoichi Sugita, and he too, like his fellow pilots, took the loss of Yamamoto personally and swore to himself to avenge it. But he, apparently, had a different way of approaching this vengeance. Instead of a glorious death, Shoichi Sugita wanted to survive in any way possible, because he saw redemption differently. He clearly believed that shooting down as many American aircraft as possible was the best way to exact vengeance. And over the coming weeks and months after April of 1943, he would do exactly that. Sugita quickly began to rack up kills in the South Pacific. In the missions where the other escorting Zero pilots were lost, he paid the Americans back. He shot down American fighters time and time again, Wildcats, P-38s, and any other adversary that he ran into. By the late summer, he was not only the leading ace of the 204th Air Group, but the overall leader of the Solomon Islands campaign for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now, it is also important to remember that the documentation of these kill claims is hard to come by due to Japanese record keeping. But according to my best estimates, around this time, Sugita likely had around 40 kills in the South Pacific. In August, however, he too would meet a worthy adversary. In an attempted intercept against American bombers, Sugita was caught in the sights of an enemy fighter and was hit in the engine. His Zero then caught fire and began going down. And then, in what was mostly an unpopular move for Japanese pilots, Sugita bailed out, parachuting down into friendly territory. When he landed, he was still alive, but had received severe burns. So, after being treated, he was then, like Kenji Yanagiya, sent back to Japan to recover from his injuries. This now left 2 surviving Zero pilots from the Yamamoto mission, both in recovery from combat injuries. But their story was not over. In March of 1944, 7 months later, Shoichi Sugita had recovered enough to fly again. And being one of the highest scoring aces in the war for Japan, his skills were very much needed. So he was then sent back to Guam, where he began to fight again. In the next few weeks, he raised his score even more, downing American bombers and fighters at a staggering pace. But things were not going quite so well for the rest of the Japanese Navy. At one point here during the summer, his unit, the 263rd Air Group, was essentially completely exhausted, as they had taken high losses during the Marianas Turkey shoot in June. So the remaining 6 aircraft of his unit were ordered to fly to a base farther back from the front lines to be transferred. During this flight, however, they were ambushed by American Hellcats, and the Navy fighters hit all of the Zeros in the flight. Sugita, however, was the sole survivor. His plane was hit badly and his navigation equipment was shot out, but miraculously, navigating by mostly intuition, he made it to his destination as one of the only living members of the 263rd Air Group. Still, not giving up his fight, he was transferred to a new group and continued to wreak havoc on American forces until October of 1944. At this point, his new unit, the 201st Air Group, was reorganized as the first official kamikaze special attack team of the Imperial Navy. Now, this unit was not specifically kamikaze pilots themselves, but instead were assigned to fly escort for the suicide bombers themselves. Their job was to protect them and confirm the results of their attacks. Eventually, though, after serving here, he was moved to one more final unit, based near Okinawa in early 1945. Now, with around 70 kills to his name, he was one of the most prized assets in the Imperial Japanese Navy. On April 15th of 1945, however, his career finally came to an end. During a scramble to intercept American aircraft, Sugita's plane was just getting off the ground from the island of Kyushu when F-6F Hellcats of the U.S. Navy arrived. Vulnerable and an easy target, Sugita's fighter was hit as it tried to get airborne, crashing just beyond the runway and killing the last frontline member of the famous Yamamoto flight and one of Japan's most storied aces. This left only one other living pilot from the Yamamoto mission, Kenji Yanagiya. Yanagiya, after losing his right hand, eventually recovered to the point where he was assigned to train pilots in Japan and was promoted to warrant officer. He served this position well, but never saw combat again, finishing the war with 8 victories and residing in Tokyo after the war. For many years, he did not speak of his role in the Yamamoto mission, as he carried responsibility for what had happened. That is until the 1970s, when he was discovered and interviewed by a Japanese author. After this, he was invited to a meeting at the Admiral Nimitz Museum in Texas in 1988 with all of the other surviving P-38 pilots from Operation Vengeance.
We are also honored, of course, to have with us today the surviving Zero pilot, Kenji Yanagiya.
He shook hands with Rex Barber and the other American pilots, where historians and veterans alike celebrated one of the most famous events in World War II. Warrant Officer Kenji Yanagiya finally passed away in 2008 at the age of 88, the final Zero pilot from the Yamamoto raid to go. Hopefully, here he was fully redeemed from his role in the fateful mission in April of 1943. Please consider supporting me on Patreon so I can make more videos like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.